Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to my chapter-by-chapter read-along of J.R.R. Tolkien's masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, where I am now in the Fellowship of the Ring. I started midships with Two Towers, moved on to The Return of the King. Now we're in the Fellowship of the Ring, and we are at one of the dramatic high points of this book. This is the chapter, The Bridge at Khazad, and it finds the Fellowship of the Ring. All of the Fellowship, minus Bill the Pony, are in the dwarf city of Dwarodelf. They're in the mines of Moria. And they've had a fairly uneventful trip. Traveling through the mines, they're going underneath the mountains. Gandalf vaguely remembers the way. They haven't encountered any resistance. They have the vague idea that they're not alone. But that all changes now. As we saw in the last chapter, our heroes are now in the Chamber of Marzarbul, which is the resting place of Balin, son of Fundin, the dwarf who went to Moria specifically to open it up and begin a great work, become Lord of Moria. That expedition came to ill. All are dead. And in the Chamber of Marzarbul, we find an old book that Gandalf can gently turn its pages. Keep in mind, it's been a long time that these corpses have been here. These skeletons have been here. The book is old, desiccated, it's covered in dried blood. And it tells in fragments the story of those years, of the years that the dwarfs were here, where they open a great work, but they're right away dying. Orcs are right away killing some of them. The Watcher in the Water, the creature that we saw last time, takes one of them, one of the dwarfs from The Hobbit, dies horribly that way. Balin himself dies, shot by an orc with an arrow from behind a rock. And gradually, their situation becomes more and more desperate until, as Gandalf has finished reading the book, the excerpts that he can make out, the book says that they are trapped in the Chamber of Marzarbul and that there are drums coming and that they can't get out. And no sooner does Gandalf say that than in one of the most heavy-handed bits of melodrama in the whole of this book, the Fellowship suddenly hears drums. And they say, we're trapped, we can't get out, they are coming, because the forces that they have awoken in Moria have now found them. They're coming from one direction only. There are 3 doors that lead off this chamber. 2 of them don't seem to have anybody behind them. But the doorway that faces the enemy, they quickly bolt shut. They latch it with old weapons and pieces of wood and whatnot. But there's an enemy force outside that door that wants our heroes dead. So once again, we are seeing the whole Fellowship of the Ring in combat together. This is the last time that we will see that. There are a bunch of orcs, a bunch of goblins outside that door. They also have a cave troll. And our heroes fight, and it's their attackers are not expecting such concerted resistance, so they largely hold the day. And once they beat off the first attack, they are free to flee down one of the open doorways out into the rest of Moria, and that's what they do. There are moments in here that are beautifully captured in Peter Jackson's movie. He elaborates quite a bit on this. In the book, the cave troll is trying to wedge open the door. He's trying to push the door open. He gets a shoulder in and a foot in. Boromir tries to strike him with a sword, and it notches his sword. It bounces right off Troll's scales. But Frodo has Sting, a much older and more potent weapon that is able to draw troll blood, and it makes the troll withdraw. Whereas in Peter Jackson's movie, he has the troll, the huge set piece in the Fellowship of the Ring is them fighting the troll in the Chamber of Marzarbul. It's extremely well done. Extremely well done. It's just completely different from the book. That's all. Our heroes flee. They think they might be able, if they don't encounter any more resistance, they might be able to make it outside. And if it's sunlight, if it's daylight outside, they might make it. They're that close. The bridge at Khazad, this unadorned span, Peter Jackson captures it perfectly in the movie. There are no handrails, no carvings, no nothing like that. You just walk over it single file. That leads to steps that lead directly out of Moria. The entrance at the Dimril Dale is guarded by a few orcs. Our heroes sweep right by them. But before they do that, something else happens. And you all know this. It's one of the most famous scenes in the whole book. Because it's not just orcs and trolls. There's something else. Something else. When Gandalf shuts that door and tries to ensorcel it so that it can't be opened, he is greeted by something on the other side of that door that is not a troll and not an orc, that he's never encountered before. And it nearly kills him. They vie, their magics vie with each other, and it blows him down the stairs and exhausts him so completely that he can't even light his staff. They have to grope along in darkness for a few miles. That thing is a Balrog. Again, this is beautifully done in Peter Jackson's movie. I am not one to usually say that. Usually I am nitpicking, but this sequence is beautifully done in The Fellowship of the Ring. If you've never seen Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring, I can't believe there's anybody who hasn't seen it. But if you haven't seen it, or even if you have, watch that sequence again. It's terrific. Eventually, at the very edge of the bridge of Khazad, Gandalf has to turn and confront the Balrog. As he tells everybody else, swords are of no more use here. You are out of your depth. This thing is more than any of you. I have to face this, because it's mystical in nature. And if you dig deep into the Tolkien legendarium, into the Tolkien lore, you realize that Gandalf, the Maya, is facing a Maya. They are the same thing, basically the same thing as Sauron. It's just time will do things to people. Time and physical garb will do things to people. Of course, we know, diehard Tolkien fans know, who is the more powerful of these two, despite what it looks in this book. But I want to read you that. I know you've read it a million times. I know everybody has. But I want to read you it again, just because it's just so good. The dark figure, streaming with fire, raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and bellowed like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment the orcs quailed, and the fiery shadow halted. Because even Balrogs will stop for just a second if a horn of Gondor, essentially a horn of Westerness, is blown. Then the echoes died as suddenly as the flame blown out by a dark wind, and the enemy advanced again. "Over the bridge," cried Gandalf, recalling his strength. "Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you. I must hold the narrow way. Fly!" Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground, side by side, behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway of the hall's end and turned, unable to leave their leader to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge, and at that moment, in the movie, Gandalf actually pushes Aragorn, shoves him, and the look on Viggo Mortensen's face when he does that is one of wounded confusion. What on earth? It's really well done. You blink and you miss it, but it's really well done. We don't get that in this. This is a case where the book and the movie really complement each other. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his hand, but in his other hand, Glamdring, his sword, gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and in the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." The Balrog made no answer. Could it? Could it have spoken? The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge and suddenly drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still Gandalf could be seen glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. I would think that sentence would put to rest the much vexed fan debating about whether or not Balrogs have wings. They clearly do. They're mentioned in this passage. From out of the shadow, a red sword leaped flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then stood still again. "You cannot pass," he said. With a bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. "He cannot stand alone," cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge. "Elendil," he shouted, "I am with you, Gandalf." "Gondor," cried Boromir, and leaped after him. At that moment Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained poised, quivering like the tongue of a rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools," he cried, and was gone. The first time through this book, that's a shocker and no mistake. The first time through this book, he's the last person that you expected this to happen to. You expected that one of the expendable hobbits would get picked off first, but no. Gandalf, the leader of the Fellowship, seems to fall into the abyss. Now, I'm sure that on YouTube you can see this scene. And I'm sure that on YouTube somebody industrious has stitched together this scene with the beginning of The Two Towers, the Peter Jackson movie, where we see the rest of that, including an unbelievable visual of the waters at the bottom of the world. It's just incredibly done. We don't get that here. Gandalf falls into shadow, and that's it. Our heroes are stunned, but they need to get out of Moria, so they rush for the final gate. They brush aside and kill the orcs that are guarding there, and they find themselves out in the sunlight. Broad, beautiful day. It's not even noon yet. But they're stunned, and we'll encounter that next time. They're absolutely stunned. They have made it through Moria. That part has succeeded, but at the highest possible price. So there we go. That is the Bridge of Khazad, a great chapter in Lord of the Rings. We've got a couple of great ones still to go, so we're just going to keep moving on until we're done with the Fellowship. I'll wrap this up for now. I'll rejoin you next time. Thank you, BookTube.